Hey everyone, I'm Mike Mazer. I'm the CEO of Zero. You can find us at zerofasting.com. And I'm really excited to be here today with Dr. Rhonda Patrick. Hey Rhonda.
Hey.
So we're here today because we received a ton of questions from the Zero community and Rhonda's community at Found My Fitness. And it was about all things fasting. So you submitted almost 500 questions to us, a great turnout. And while we can't get through all 500 today, we went through them and found themes of certain topics around fasting and related topics that you want to hear about. So without further ado, we'll get into the questions. But Rhonda, before we do that, let's talk a bit about your background for folks that might not know. So you did your PhD work at University of Tennessee. And then you went on to do your research at St. Jude, which of course is doing great work trying to solve childhood cancer.
That's right. Yeah. So I did all my graduate research at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which is affiliated with the University of Tennessee. And while I was there, I studied the interface between mitochondrial metabolism and cancer and cell death. And so there's sort of, became this expert in mitochondria, in cancer metabolism, and how cells die or don't die. And that was sort of my focus during my graduate research there.
That's phenomenal. Yeah, I've actually been working with St. Jude more on the fundraising side since 2011. So that's a cool connection that we have for just what's an amazing organization.
Very amazing.
Yeah.
Just cutting edge research going on there. For
Absolutely.
Sure, so.
Well, let's get into the questions. We'll get through as many as we can. And given that it's bright and early in the morning here in San Diego, we got a ton of questions about coffee and caffeine and how it may or may not impact the beneficial effects of fasting. So let's get right into it if that's cool.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, great. So I've got my cheat sheet here on my iPad. The first question from John Phillips is, can you discuss in further detail why you recommend a water-only fast versus consuming coffee or amino acids while in a fasted state? I'm looking to optimize my morning workouts with amino acids or a caffeine boost and want to know what benefits I am potentially missing out on versus the benefits I likely still receive. So coffee, amino acids.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question there.
Yes, dense.
But the coffee question, as you mentioned, is something that's certainly, it's asked quite frequently. And to sort of address that question, I think people mostly are asking it in the context of a type of fasting called time-restricted eating. Time-restricted eating, it has a fasting component to it, but it also has a circadian biology component to it. And people might go, well, what is circadian biology? And really, just sort of think about the fact that, you're awake during certain times. So you're awake in the morning, early in the morning, your body produces a stress hormone called cortisol, wakes you up, you're alert, you're active, you do all your activities. And then as the day progresses and nighttime comes on, you get sleepy, your body's making melatonin, it helps you with, getting tired, and then you go to sleep and things sort of shut down, right?
All so there's these natural pathways.
Right, it's just sort of this rhythm, this circadian rhythm. That's why they call it, circadian rhythm. Yep. So it turns out, every cell in our body has one of those, and including, pathways like metabolism. So it's really important to make sure that you're consuming food when, the metabolic pathways are active. You don't want to eat when they're not active. And so a lot of this work has been done by Dr. Sachin Panda at the Salk Institute and some of his colleagues. They've shown that what activates metabolism is, basically when you take in your first food, you activate those metabolic pathways, and then they'll be active for a certain amount of time, and then as the day goes on, they become less active. For example, if you look at men who eat the same meal early in the morning, and then they eat the same meal later in the evening, same calories, same macronutrient content, everything, they're more insulin sensitive in the morning, and they're less insulin sensitive in the evening. Fatty acid metabolism is the same way. So you may think, well, maybe I'll just eat some fat in the evening. Well, it turns out your fatty acids and being able to use those as energy is also on a circadian clock, and it's less active in the evening as well. So, with that said, where does coffee come into play?
Right.
Coffee. If you're talking about coffee with cream, obviously cream is got calories and fat, and that's something that would be considered, food, right? Cream. If you're talking about just black coffee without, any
or espresso, like a shot of espresso.
Exactly, or espresso, something without any calories, essentially.
Right.
Then the question becomes, does that count as, starting your clocks? And, there's no real direct data that has addressed that question. A couple of my thoughts are, for one, we do know that caffeine itself changes the circadian clocks. So if you give someone a cup of coffee later in the day, it actually shifts the body's circadian clock, that natural rhythm, by like 40 minutes. So coffee itself is changing the circadian clocks.
It's extending it essentially. Into
Yeah,
the evening.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
And additionally, caffeine is metabolized by the gut. It's also metabolized by the liver. So the question is, does that, activating those metabolic pathways, does that start your clocks? We don't really know if it's enough to or not. What we do know is that, there have been some studies, for example, a study done by Dr. Ruth Patterson at UCSD. She looked at time-restricted eating in women that had previously had breast cancer, women that ate all of their food within 11 hours and they fasted for 13 hours. During that 13 hours, they were allowed to consume caffeine, so black coffee or tea without cream. And even though they consumed the coffee during their fasting period, they still had a 36% reduction in breast cancer recurrence. So they had positive benefits. Along the same lines, there's been some pilot studies in people with type 2 diabetes where they've done time-restricted eating for anywhere between a 6 to 8 hour window. So they're eating within a shorter window and they're fasting for 16 or more hours a day. They're also allowed to consume caffeine or tea, and they had positive effects on blood glucose regulation, insulin sensitivity, weight loss. So clearly there's evidence in the scientific literature that if you consume black coffee within that fasting window, there's still positive effects happening.
So if I can paraphrase, while coffee or caffeine may slightly interrupt the circadian window, the metabolic benefits from black coffee or tea without additives are maintained?
It seems as though, at least according to these studies, that it's not negating those metabolic benefits.
Okay.
However, the question becomes, if you were not to consume that, would you have a more robust effect?
Got it.
We don't know.
We need to study on this because this is like one of the most common questions we get. But I guess the early directional research is, and for a lot of people, coffee, including myself, coffee is crucial. Okay for right now, and we'll learn more about the detail level of what's happening maybe.
Well, and I also think that if you're talking about just, like I mentioned, time-restricted eating, this is something that you're practicing on a daily basis, right? This is, you're eating your food within an 8 to 12-hour time window, and you're fasting, for 16 or up to 12 to 16 hours, right? There's other types of fasting which we can talk about, where you're doing it longer.
We're going to get into that with another question with different modalities of fasting.
Yeah, and in that case, research has also shown if you consume black coffee or tea without any calories, that there's still benefits.
Great.
And
what about the amino acid aspect?
Right, that's a great question as well. And this sort of touches on another aspect of the fasting literature. And that is, there are many benefits that occur during a fast, and there are many types of fasting. And when you're actually fasting, some of the things that are occurring are you're lowering you're deactivating pathways that are typically like a grow pathway. For example, it's called IGF1. It's a grow pathway. mTOR is another grow pathway. Both of those pathways are activated by amino acids. And so if you're limiting your amino acid intake along with your caloric intake and everything else, you're going to deactivate those pathways. And the deactivation of those pathways, IGF1 will go down, mTOR will go down, and those are essential for the activation of some of the benefits of fasting, including a process called autophagy, which is basically when your cells start to recycle, and interestingly, they seem to recycle damaged components of themselves. So like mitochondria, which are, they're the powerhouse of energy in your cell. Damaged mitochondria can be cleared away.
So spring cleaning is the process of autophagy
Right.
within your body.
You know, pieces of protein,
Yep.
dead cell things are just in there. It gets rid of them. But mTOR has to be, deactivated. IGF1 has to be deactivated for that to happen. So and then there's other things as well, like which we can talk about when we get into more of a prolonged type of fast.
Yep.
Those things also need to be deactivated. So amino acids would be something that would sort of negate that.
Interrupt that natural reduction of IGF1,
Right.
which may interfere with some autophagy.
Right.
Got it. Okay, great. Well, that's certainly important for a lot of folks in our audience. I'm going to move on to the next question. Still caffeine related. We had a ton of coffee questions, but I think we can probably dovetail off your last answer. This one's from Maruna Heckman. Hope I got that name right. First of all, thanks for all that you do. That's for you, Rhonda. You've changed my life. Wow, that's awesome. Is there any more evidence yet surrounding if having coffee, tea, supplements, etc., while fasting disrupts the benefits of fasting? I think you just answered most of that.
I think so. Yeah.
So it sounds like if you keep it to caffeine only, you're not really interfering with IGF1 and mTOR, but maybe not trying to add anything on top of that. What about electrolytes, though? Because we get a lot of questions. Electrolytes are, I guess, technically a supplement. You're supplementing your natural biochemistry with, magnesium or salts. Any thoughts on that?
I do think that if for time restricted eating, I personally like to try to take everything within my eating window, but I don't think it's really key when you're talking about things like sodium, potassium, magnesium.
Right.
As far as I know, that's not really changing any of the circadian rhythm. But when you're talking about a prolonged fast, when people are fasting for example, maybe 48 hours or
Right.
more, and by the way, as you get into a more prolonged fast, that's something that you may want to do under medical supervision.
Yeah, absolutely. I should say now that while you're a PhD, you're not a practicing clinician, and so none of what we talk about today should be construed as medical advice, but research findings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Information. So basically, the electrolyte stuff, I think that there is evidence in the literature. You look at someone that's doing a prolonged fast, you do start to deplete things like sodium and potassium immediately. Those things sort of taper off as the fast goes on. But I do think there is some evidence that it's good to take an electrolyte supplement,
Right.
Particularly with a prolonged
And
fast.
if you're doing water only,
Right.
even more important, right?
Yeah. So there's a variety of mineral and electrolyte supplements out there.
Cool.
So.
Okay, great. I think we've covered most of the coffee and caffeine questions, which is great to get started. You talked a little bit about time-restricted feeding. Next question, I think, we'll build on that, which is from Sam Reyes. The question is, has there been any evidence suggesting one method of fasting is more beneficial than others?
Right. I think that's a really good question.
It's a very broad question.
It's a very broad question, but it sort of gives me a chance to describe some of the different types of fasting, which I kind of touched on already. But you hear in popular culture, you hear everyone say intermittent fasting.
Right.
And intermittent fasting becomes this blanket term for all things fasting.
Like Walter Longo doesn't like that term because
Right.
it's just so general.
Right, Dr. Walter Longo from USC, who is really an expert. He does a lot of research on fasting. He has mentioned how intermittent fasting can be considered in humans fasting up to about 24 hours, and then prolonged fasting happens when you get into the 48-hour mark, so 2 days or longer. And then of course there's time restricted eating, which has a intermittent fasting component to it, but it also has that circadian biology component to it. You want to eat within the time when your metabolism is optimal, and when you're not eating, you're obviously fasting. And so people end up doing up to 16-hour fasting periods. So if they're eating within an 8-hour window, they're fasting for 16 hours.
Which
and that's
of course
time restricted
colloquially
eating.
is called 16-8.
It's 16-8, yeah, exactly.
Right.
So that would also be time restricted eating. That's something that you're doing on a daily basis. And so, as I had already mentioned, with the time restricted eating, you get the benefits of the fasting part. So you're fasting for 16 hours. Part of the benefits, with that are things like you do start to have repair processes that are activated in order to repair damage, whether it's damage to your DNA or damage to proteins, or just damage, like I mentioned, mitochondria, or just pieces of dead cells floating around. That stuff is cleared away and repaired during a fasting state. So you get that with the intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating, which has a fasting component. In addition, the time-restricted eating, you have the benefits, and this has been shown by Dr. Sachin Panda, Ruth Patterson, others, that you're eating within your circadian biology in terms of when your metabolism is its most optimal. So you don't want to, for example, if you eat your first bite of food at 8 a.m. in the morning, and then you're eating dinner at 8:30 or 9, you're basically, you've already gone past 12 hours. Sure. Your metabolism at 8:30 or 9 isn't going to be very good. And what may end up happening is you're not going to be as insulin sensitive, so your blood glucose levels are going to be higher, your fasting blood glucose is going to be higher, your fatty acid metabolism is not as good, so you're going to start to store fatty acids in adipose tissue rather than using them as energy. So you'll start to gain more fat mass, which has all sorts of problems. In addition to that, you may also, your body, because you have been going, it's been over a 12-hour mark, when you eat that food in the evening, you may be resetting the clock, and your body thinks it's resetting the start time of metabolism. So the whole time you're sleeping is when your metabolism's at its best, and then you wake up in the morning and it's completely misaligned. So everything is misaligned in terms of your metabolism. And so that means that you're always going to have higher blood glucose levels. Your fatty acids are going to be more likely to be stored in adipose tissue rather than used as energy. So that misalignment. So that's the benefit for time-restricted eating, or time-restricted feeding, as it's called with animal studies. And then, as you mentioned, Dr. Valter Longo's research, he does a lot of research on what's called prolonged fasting, typically 48 hours or longer. Again, as you get into that, you may want to do that under medical supervision. Now, he has done a lot of research in animals showing that, if you do a prolonged fast, not only do you have this autophagy start to activate, which we talked about, as the fast becomes more prolonged, you actually start to get the clearing away of cells. Damaged cells seems to be preferentially damaged cells that are cleared away. And in the process of that happening, you actually activate stem cells and sort of replenish those damaged cells with new healthy young cells. Wow. Now, he's shown this in animals where literally during the fasting period, organs will shrink. And then during the refeeding period, which we'll talk about a little bit later, they regrow. So you're basically getting rid of the damaged cells, mostly it seems, and then you're replenishing them with healthy new young cells, and they're regrowing. Now, that's all been done in animal studies. He has some preliminary evidence in humans where it seems as though looking at various markers of stem cell activation, for example, that does seem to be happening. But he's got some ongoing studies where they're going to look at that in much more detail. So that's a benefit of the prolonged fasting, which you don't really get from a shorter fast. Right. Because you need to really have a stronger stress. You have to have your IGF1 levels really dip down. That takes time.
And I think their product Prolon, which we won't get too much into, but it has some calories per day, but that's like a 5-day regimen. So you're really looking at kind of 5 days to get most of those benefits you discussed?
So Prolon is that's the name for their fasting mimicking diet, right, which was developed by Dr. Valter Longo, and it's has a very specific macronutrient content, so a specific amount of fat and protein and carbohydrates, and a total caloric cap. So I think that the first day it's up to 1,000 calories, and then the second to the fifth day you're getting a little over 700 calories a day. Right. And he has shown, he's shown in animal studies the same benefits with the organ shrinking and then regrowing. Yep. And then he's done some clinical studies in humans showing a variety of metabolic benefits. You're getting, of course, improved glucose levels, insulin sensitivity. He shows IGF1 does go down. And cholesterol, there's benefits with your cholesterol, metabolism, things like that. Right. So that's also another sort of part of fasting. So
same idea of a prolonged fast that you mentioned, where you're getting the autophagy and the stem cell production over a multiple day fast, except in his case, bringing low calories into the equation, ostensibly to probably make it just easier for people to stick with than a water-only fast.
Definitely seems like it's easier for people to stick with, or at least try out. In animals, he has shown that you do get a lot of the same benefits as a water fast, but you have to remember, animals have a much faster metabolism
Sure,
than humans.
right.
And in fact,
Great point.
if you fast a mouse, a rodent, for 48 hours, they lose 20% of their body weight.
Wow.
A human loses maybe 2%.
I can tell you from experience that doesn't happen for
No.
me. I've tried, but no.
So the question then becomes, well, how much of the organ shrinking, regrowing do you
Sure.
get with just a fasting mimicking for 5 days versus, actually not eating, or, so there's lots of little nuances that aren't quite figured out yet.
Yep.
But certainly there are benefits, and he's shown that in humans.
So just to wrap up the question, it sounds like, the question is a fasting type more beneficial than other? It sounds like there are different instruments, different tools for different outcomes. And maybe combining some of these modalities, maybe doing time restricted feeding, circadian more regularly, and then periodically to kind of get those cleansing benefits. Metabolic cleansing, you do maybe a longer one if your doctor says it's okay and you're cleared for it. Could that be a good sort of sequencing for people?
Yeah, and I think that's a good summary, and I think I should probably also mention another benefit that comes from both intermittent fasting and certainly prolonged fasting is your body shifts from glucose metabolism, metabolizing carbohydrates, to fatty acid metabolism.
Ketones.
And you get the production of ketone bodies like beta hydroxybutyrate, which is in and of itself been shown by people like Dr. Eric Verdin to be anti-aging in a sense, where it's a signaling molecule that's been shown to activate genetic pathways in the body that are known to delay age-related diseases, that are known to help increase repair processes. It's been shown to reduce damage that's generated by your mitochondria, which are basically what's generating most of the energy inside of your cells. But that whole process of generating energy, what we known as metabolism, generates a lot of very harmful reactive byproducts, and beta hydroxybutyrate lowers that, so it kind of makes your mitochondria more efficient.
Got it.
That's another benefit with the intermittent fasting and certainly the prolonged fasting.
Cool. Well, let's. I'm sure you could spend a whole day talking about different fasting types, but we don't have that much time because we have other questions. So let's move into you talked about ketones a bit in that last answer, so let's move on to a question about ketones from Austin. Will consumption of exogenous ketones disrupt a fasting state? And I know that there's been a lot of work in producing ketone supplements. So that's the question, I think, is will that disrupt a fast?
It's certainly a question that I've had myself. I've actually tried a beta hydroxybutyrate ester. So beta hydroxybutyrate is the major circulating ketone body that's generated when your body starts to go into ketogenesis. A lot of things do happen when you're fasting, and that's one of them. So basically, it takes anywhere between 12 to 36 hours for your liver to deplete the glycogen. Mm-hmm. And once that's depleted, what ends up happening is you immobilize fatty acids from your adipose tissue. They go to the liver, and they're actually used to make ketone bodies. So you're oxidizing the fatty acids now, using them to make ketone bodies like beta hydroxybutyrate. Those ketone bodies can then be used as an alternative energy source themselves.
Which is incredible. I mean, just on that point, the fact that the analog I've heard is you're basically turning your body from burning gas to diesel. It's like a completely different fuel, glucose to ketones. It's amazing that our bodies can even do that, and in some ways, it's a preferred fuel for different organs in our body, right?
It seems as though it might be. Yeah. It certainly seems to be metabolically efficient. Mm-hmm. So it takes less energy to use a ketone body compared to glucose. So it's energetically favorable in that sense, which is nice.
So it sounds like it doesn't really interrupt a fast. It's sort of part of the natural.
Well, let me continue. So that was the natural phenomena I was explaining, right?
Got it.
Now what ends up happening? So there's been about 5 clinical studies that I've read mm-hmm. They're mostly clinical studies with exogenous ketone esters.
And just for the audience, exogenous meaning not produced in the body. You're taking it externally.
Exactly. You're taking a supplemental form of it. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. So the exogenous ketone esters that are taken, basically, a lot of the studies that have been done have been looking in the context of athletic performance. Mm-hmm. But they also look at other metabolic parameters, which is interesting because that's kind of where you can find some of this data if you look carefully.
Right.
And within these 5 studies, there have been, it seems to be that what's been shown is that the exogenous, consuming, for example, the exogenous beta-hydroxybutyrate, the supplemental beta-hydroxybutyrate ester, it increases the blood levels, of beta-hydroxybutyrate pretty high. But it also seems to decrease circulating free fatty acids, which suggests you're not immobilizing fatty acids from your adipose tissue to be used to make your own, which means you may not be getting the benefit of what you would call fat loss, right? And that's a regulatory loop that occurs in the body. So when your beta hydroxybutyrate levels get high enough, your body says, okay, we don't need to make any more of these, so it stops the immobilizing called lipolysis, the cutting of the fatty acids from the adipose tissue, right?
Interesting.
So your body's stopping you from making too much, right? So that does seem to happen.
Okay.
But then again, the exogenous ketone esters don't last for that long, and if you're exercising or doing physical activity, it's dose dependent. So the more active you are, the quicker you use up those ketone bodies.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know that when I'm practicing fasting, which gets my ketones way up, and then I'm doing a ketogenic diet, which does the same thing, and then I go for a big workout, I'll come back and measure my ketone bodies, and they're way down.
Right.
And I guess it's because I've been using my ketones during the workout.
For energy, yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my one caveat with that I would be aware of with consuming the beta-hydroxybutyrate supplemental esters or salts if you want, but salts don't work that well. A good point is that they've also been shown consuming the exogenous beta-hydroxybutyrate has been shown in humans to prevent the use of amino acids from muscle. So it stops, and which also is, makes sense. During a prolonged fast, your body has mechanisms at play that help prevent you from, using proteins and amino acids from your muscle as energy. And one of those is that, the ketone bodies prevents that from happening. So that's a good thing. But so there's a trade-off potentially.
Yep.
And again, this is something that, I don't know how much of a difference it makes, but it's something to keep in mind.
Yep. And if you're an athlete and you're needing fuel, maybe you're a better candidate than someone that's just looking for purely metabolic, body-based ketone production. And that's a maybe, but it's a factor. Well, that's a great segue actually to another question related to exercise and growth. Let's see. So I practice, this is from Angel or Angel, hope I got the name right. So I practice a simple 12-hour eating window and a 24-hour fast once a week. So there's intermittent fasting with a 24-hour fast per week. My question is, are there any downsides to training fasted, as I usually do? The exercises involved are heavy weight training and moderate cardio afterwards. Just wanted to know if I'm metabolically doing harm or having adverse effects of the intended goals. Thanks and love your work.
Great question.
Yeah.
There have been meta-analyses of studies done, so that just means there's lots of studies that have been that have looked at, for example, doing physical activity, either aerobic or anaerobic activity in a fasted state versus pre-exercise feeding, so you eat before exercise. And a meta-analysis just kind of aggregates all those studies that have been done and looks at what the data says. And so meta-analysis that have been done on that topic have shown that pre-feeding before exercise it seems to improve long duration aerobic exercise, so durations longer than 60 minutes.
Got it.
But it doesn't seem to really have much of an effect on performance if it's aerobic exercise less than 60 minutes.
Okay.
On a similar note, it's also pre-feeding, eating before you exercise has also been shown to improve anaerobic exercise, so like run till exhaustion, but it doesn't really seem to have much of a significant effect on high intensity interval training. So there is a little bit of a performance enhancement with eating before you work out in terms of long duration aerobic exercise.
Triathletes, long distance running, things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Which actually makes sense.
But for weight training, sounds like if you're keeping it within 60 minutes.
So even less than even running less than 60 minutes or a high intensity interval training class. But what's really interesting is those meta-analyses showed that eating before you exercise, so if you're training fasted, you get really robust enhancements in glucose, sensitivity, but really robust enhancements in your mitochondrial adaptations to using fatty acids. So your mitochondria become really primed for fatty acid use, which makes sense. If you're in a fasted state,
Right.
you're going to have, you're depleting your glucose and you have more of these fatty acids that are available for energy. There's a lot of increased activity in genes that regulate fatty acid metabolism. That's really expressed when you train in a fasted state. Interestingly, when you feed before you train, those adaptations are blunted. With respect to the fatty acid
Right.
uptake, like the really priming your mitochondria to be like robust to use fatty acids as a source of energy. You still get glucose, effects and enhancements and stuff even when you're training, when you're, eat something beforehand. But it seems as though the fatty acid adaptations that the mitochondria shift to are blunted somewhat.
So it sounds like for Angel or Angel, that if you're doing kind of a weightlifting with cardio, shouldn't be a dramatic effect.
I will add to that, because I think even one of the previous questions you were asking, someone was asking about the amino acids, wanting the amino acid take before they train, and they were wanting to for hypertrophy.
Yep.
So basically wanting to grow more muscle. I will say that there have been studies there's been a lot of research that has been done looking at, is there this anabolic window that you have to take in amino acids and protein to increase muscle growth? And I think over the past few years, it's been pretty consensus that there's a lot longer time that you have. It used to be thought there's this 1 hour window and you have to down this protein shake immediately or you're going to miss it.
Right.
I don't think that's the case. I think that there's been a lot of research that has come out showing that you actually can take in amino acid or protein hours after a workout. However, if you're going into your workout fasted, let's say you've been fasting for 16 hours.
Yep.
You aren't storing protein. So in that case, if you are doing a fasted strength training workout, you may want to consume protein within an hour after that.
Got it. Good distinction.
Yeah.
If you're in a fasted state.
If you're in a fasted state, a pretty fasted
well, I think that's
state.
a great recap for Angel or Angel. Not sure. Okay, moving on to the next question. I think we have time for maybe one or two more, because they require a lot of explanation. Let's talk about longevity, because that's a lot of the reason that our audience and your audience, is doing fasting. So this is from Nina. Can you elaborate on the growth longevity trade-off? And you talked a little bit about that at the beginning with IGF1 and longevity. So the growth longevity trade-off: by fasting, we downregulate the aging pathways such as mTOR, growth hormone, and IGF1. So clearly Nina's done her homework and listened to you. But in order to build muscle through resistance training, we need to eat protein and have these pathways activated in order to build muscle. Is there a way we can get the best of both worlds? It's a great question. Is the trade-off overstated? How so? Thank you! Exclamation point. That's a meaty question, but it relates to a lot of what you talked about already.
It does, and I think I will try to keep it as brief as possible. I think I do need to kind of just briefly explain the role of IGF1, mTOR in aging and in the field of aging research. There have been many studies that have shown that higher IGF1, particularly higher IGF1, is associated with higher cancer incidence, and this has been shown. If you look in humans, humans that have a mutation in genes that regulate IGF1 that make them have a higher IGF1 level all the time, they have actually higher cancer incidence than people that don't have those.
And the idea there is that if your IGF1's high, it's a growth mechanism, and it could promote tumors to grow.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So because IGF1 is a growth signal, as you mentioned, it allows basically, when you have accumulated damage in your cells, whether that damage comes from the mitochondria, genomic damage, there are signaling pathways that are activated that say, look, this cell's too damaged to repair. I need to kill it. I need to get rid of it because I may acquire a very dangerous mutation that could allow cancer to survive. And so your body has this beautiful way of doing that. And it's called programmed cell death or apoptosis, basically kill the cell. But IGF-1, if IGF-1 is around and expressed at a high level, it's kind of around going, no, grow, you're cool, you can stay, I'm here.
Forget about the damaged cell.
Yeah,
Let's
forget
just
about,
move on.
Yeah, so it basically overrides those checkpoints that says die. And so it can become very dangerous because then it can allow us one cell to then grow, which then replicates and makes more cells, and then you eventually get the formation of a tumor. Sometimes this takes several decades to happen. And then, of course, it bypasses immune cells and things like that are also involved in killing the cells. But that is one important way that IGF-1 plays a role in cancer. Humans that have more of it have a higher cancer incidence, and the vice versa. So humans that have mutations that make less of it have less cancer incidence. It's been shown in many, many animal studies. Dr. Walter Longo has shown this, and others, and so many others, that IGF-1 can override. If you basically inject human tumor cells into a mouse and increase their IGF-1 by a variety of modalities, including high protein intake, you can actually allow the cancer cells to grow faster.
Yeah, and just real quick on the high protein intake, I mean, the latest diet trend, I think it's waning, has just been protein, right? And so, I mean, we have yet to see the impacts, long term of all that protein uptake, which is, I think, interesting. I don't want to concern people, but protein does upregulate IGF-1, correct?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And to address the good part of IGF-1, I mean, so we talked about this bad part where it's
and Nina's asking, about that trade-off, like
exactly.
And
IGF-1, in addition to the cancer, it also deactivates a very important longevity pathway, a gene in the body called FOXO. Which is really, really associated with, it regulates all sorts of genes that are involved in repair and stem cell production, autophagy, all those things.
So high IGF-1
turns that off.
So
it turns off autophagy, turns off all that stuff.
Interesting, okay.
So
she was eating no protein?
No. So the trade-off is that IGF-1 has a really good, it's also very important. I mean, obviously during development, it's part of the growth pathway. You need it to grow.
Right.
But it's also an important grow pathway in muscle to repair muscle, to grow muscle, which is also important for longevity. I mean, there's multiple studies that have come out even recently showing that muscle mass is really important for lowering all-cause mortality and preventing frailty and things like that. Mm-hmm. It also gets into the brain as an important growth factor for neurons. It actually helps you grow new neurons. That's called neurogenesis, and it actually helps prevent neurons from dying. So it allows the existing neurons to keep living. So it's an important signaling pathway in your brain and muscle. I've seen a handful of studies in mice and in humans that have shown exercise, being physically active, helps bring IGF-1 into the brain, so it crosses over the blood-brain barrier and gets it into the brain where you want it, and also gets into the muscle. So as opposed to having your IGF-1 around in your bloodstream where then goes to other tissues or stays around and is being a growth signal for potentially damaged cells, you actually want it to get into your brain, into your muscle. So I think exercise and physical activity is a really good way to make sure that IGF-1 that you're getting is going to the right places. And in fact,
interesting.
There have been studies looking at protein intake and all-cause mortality that have shown that higher protein intake does increase all-cause mortality and cancer mortality as well. However, in people that have none of the unhealthy lifestyle factors that are looked at, for example, they're not obese, they are physically active, they don't smoke, they're not drinking excessive alcohol, and they still have high protein intake, they have the same mortality and cancer mortality rate as someone that has a lower protein.
That's a great recap. And I guess intuitively, if you're going to give your body all this fuel and growth, use it.
Exactly.
Use it for what it's designed to do, and then. But if you're giving all that fuel and you're not using it, it can be left to do not so great things.
Yeah. But to I went on the tangent there to kind of get to her the second part of her question, which was,
is there a happy medium?
Yeah,
what's the golden rule here?
Where's the sweet spot?
Yeah.
For a long time, it was thought, this process of what's known as caloric restriction which does lower IGF1, but you're doing it all the time. You're constantly eating like 30% less than what you would, and it's not. Some people are kind of miserable doing it. You're chronically lowering your IGF1. Is that good? Because you want IGF1s for some things. And in fact, I had a conversation with Dr. Valtalongo. He has even talked about the fact that the prolonged fast seemed to be a good sweet spot, because you're doing a prolonged fast, you actually drop your IGF1 during that fasting period, and that is what is critical for the apoptosis, the clearing away of the damaged cells. It's important to activate the stem cells, but once you get to that point and you then refeed, you actually want IGF1. You want IGF-1 because IGF-1 then allows the stem cells to grow and make more cells and replenish that population and regrow. So there's this balance, and it's like IGF-1 is important in that. It plays an important, you want it lowered to get that whole clearing away and autophagy and apoptosis.
And then the rebuilding.
And then the rebuilding, you want it. So there's this nice sweet spot. And I think
it's the beautiful machine of our body that it goes through modalities of cleansing. And it's the reason that I think fasting has become rightly, very intermittent fasting and caloric restriction has become so popular, because that's kind of how ancestrally we were brought up. I mean, we didn't have 7-Elevens and supermarkets and cupboards full of food all the time, or constantly eating. We had these natural breaks where we were hunting for food or gathering for food, and we weren't eating all the time. Our bodies were repairing, and then we got to refeed when we caught the deer and ate it, and then brought ourselves to that rebuilding phase.
Exactly.
So replicating what for millennia we've been as humans designed to do.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's an awesome question and a great answer. Do we have time for one more, or how are we doing?
Yeah.
Let's do one more.
Quick one.
Okay, we'll do it. We'll try and make it quick. Let's see. Okay, this hopefully will be pretty quick. Let's do post-fast feeding. So we get a lot of questions about this. What's the ideal way to break a fast? So you talked a little bit about this. Is there a method to the madness with macro timing? And this is from Brian Avchin. Is there a method to the madness with macro timing, and as it pertains to glycogen levels, or is it fine to eat anything, in particular once you reach or once you break your fasting window, once you end your fasting window? So what should we be consuming ideally after this fast?
Well, I think we kind of addressed that. If we're talking about the prolonged fast, or someone that's doing a fast for greater than 48 hours, you're basically at that point after your IGF-1 has gone lower and you've done some of the autophagy and clearing away of the damaged parts of the cell, and also apoptosis, the damaged cell itself. You want that IGF-1 active, and what activates IGF-1 are amino acids. So, and particularly essential amino acids. So eating some protein actually to break a fast seems like it would be a good idea, because you want that IGF-1 higher. The other thing that actually regulates IGF-1 bioavailability is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates allow IGF-1 to be more bioavailable. So most of the time you're wanting to have less IGF-1, but in this sense you want to have that regrow signal. So eating a balanced diet. But when people are breaking a prolonged fast, some people have sensitivity. Their gut's a little more sensitive if you haven't eaten for a few days.
Sure.
So you really have to sort of listen to your body.
Like a soft landing out of it.
Yeah, some people, I've had people talk to me about taking making a shake with some blueberries, and they add a little bit of protein powder, or they'll eat like a little small piece of salmon, and some fruit. Other people like to kind of ease into it with some soups or bone broths, and then eventually kind of make it a small piece of protein or something.
And if you're talking about more circadian or like 16/8, I mean, the thing I sort of want to emphasize here is that a lot of people use fasting as a license to kind of binge, which obviously is not a good idea. Like when you're breaking a fast, especially a longer fast, giving your body a chance to adjust back to a feeding state is important in eating, non-processed foods, is super important. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that eating a healthy diet with lots of vegetables and healthy meats and
Right.
fatty acids and things like that is important. Avoiding processed foods, avoiding refined sugar, all those things. I mean, if you're constantly eating refined sugars and all that, you're going to have a hard time. Your body's going to have a hard time switching over from metabolizing glucose to fatty acids. It's going to make that transition more difficult. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well.
Cool.
I did want to mention a couple of things because I forgot to mention on some of the other
Sure.
questions.
Yeah.
I think there were some questions about like autophagy and caffeine, some coffee, and if that. I talked about breaking the fast a little bit, but
yep. Does caffeine interfere with that?
yeah, and I thought that was an important point because research by Dr. Guido Kramer has shown that actually the polyphenols in coffee, and it can even be decaf coffee. It can be tea, decaf coffee. It's not the caffeine; it's the polyphenols that are in the coffee bean.
Mm-hmm.
They actually activate autophagy, and that he showed that in animals, but they actually play a role in activating autophagy itself.
I think you just made a lot of people's day because now I can drink black coffee and I get even more benefits to autophagy.
It's unclear if you're getting more benefits, but yeah, I think there does seem to be a caveat there where it seems as though drinking the black coffee may actually enhance the autophagy.
Awesome.
So.
Well, this has been great. I know we only got to a fraction of the questions. I hope we can do this again because the science is evolving. I know there's tons of new studies coming out. I mean, in 2019, I think you're on top of a bunch of new science, coming out related to fasting and human studies, et cetera.
Yeah, there's like at least 4 or 5 new clinical studies on
Yeah.
time-restricted eating, and then another handful on prolonged fasting that Dr. Valtolongo's doing. That's ongoing. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, it's a very dynamic world that we're in, which is exciting, and more data coming out. But I want to thank you, and again, for everyone who submitted questions, thank you. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but hopefully we'll be back soon with more updates. And again, Rhonda Patrick, Found My Fitness, and check out Zero Fasting. And if you haven't downloaded it or listened to Rhonda's podcast, please do so. We'll put links in the show notes. And from San Diego, that's it.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.